Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another edition of NCSL's Policy 101 series. My name is Austin Reed. I'm NCSL's Education Committee Director, and I'm going to be moderating today's session with NCSL's finest experts on K12 and education policy. This is the second of three education series that NCSL is hosting during the Policy 101 series. Last Friday, we hope you had the chance to attend our Education Finance 101 session. It's one that I was there for, and I've actually revisited multiple times since. It's always a good chance to brush up on your ed finance knowledge any chance you get. And next Friday, we hope you will attend a session that is focused on early learning. And if your schedule prevents you from watching any part of these sessions, like I said, you can always go back and watch them. Your registration includes access to all of the recordings until March 26th. But today we are talking about K12 and higher education. Our experts will cover how schools and colleges are responding to the challenges that the pandemic has brought, as well as how state legislatures are planning to address these challenges. I think it's not an understatement to say that education has changed dramatically at every level, which means that we have a lot to discuss this afternoon. If at any point you have comments to make, feel free to use the chat box. If at any point you have a question about anything in this presentation or something that wasn't covered, please put that in the Q&A section of the chat. We will have a couple points to address questions and answers, and so we hope that you'll be very active there so we can have a really rich and meaningful conversation. And while you're there, make sure your full name is listed in the nickname box. Okay, like I said, we have a lot to discuss this afternoon, so we want to get right into it. So now I'd like to introduce Michelle Ekstrom to discuss K12 education during the pandemic. Michelle is NCSL's Group Director for the Education Program and is an expert on K12 education policy. Michelle, it's really good to see you, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you over the next few minutes.
Well, thank you, Austin, and it's wonderful to be here with everyone. And I just like to welcome all of you. We're so excited to be connecting with all of our new legislators and legislative staff in this way. And so we hope that the information that we provide you is useful. And as Austin said, if you have any questions, let us know. And also, please be sure to reach out to us afterward. We're here as a resource for you. So, I'm going to cover K12 policy issues, and then later during this presentation, we're going to be joined by Sunny Day, who will be covering the higher education issues with you. So first, let's get started in the K12 arena. We know that there's a really wide impact of education within families, certainly with our children, and even within our economy. So I just wanted to start off with a few statistics so that we can actually see who it is that we're talking about and how wide the impact is actually here in the US. So right now we have about 56 million total students in our K12 system, and that's about nearly 51 million in public education and about 5 million or so in private schools. And those students attend nearly 99,000 K12 public schools and nearly 35,000 public or private schools. So as you can see, it's a lot of students and a lot of facilities for us to maintain. And when we're looking at the K12 teaching workforce, we know that this is one of the largest sectors of the workforce in the US. There are 3.7 million teachers, with 3.2 million in public education and about 500,000 in private schools. The other trend that we've noticed is that our students are becoming much more diverse. We actually have over 50%, around 54% to be exact, of public school students who are actually students of color. And about 10% of students in public education are English learners, meaning that English is not their first language. And unfortunately, we have a lot of children in the United States in poverty. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, about 18% of students live in poverty, or about 12.6 million. And so we know that that adds to the challenges that we have within the K12 education system. So as a new legislator, you might be wondering, what is the state responsibility for education? And what is my responsibility as a state legislator? First and foremost, it's important to note that education is a responsibility of the state. All 50 state constitutions actually explicitly require states to provide a free system of public education. And Dan Thatcher, in the 101 that he gave last week on education finance, went into a lot of detail about these constitutional provisions for each state. If you haven't had a chance to visit your state constitution and see exactly what the language is for you and what your responsibility is, I would highly encourage you to do that. It's also really important to note that the Supreme Court has actually ruled in this area too. In San Antonio v. Rodriguez, which is really a landmark case in education, the Supreme Court ruled that the US Constitution provides no right to an education. So again, this just confirms that this is very much a state responsibility. So as a new legislator, you might be wondering, well, what does that mean? What is the state legislative responsibility? And that really differs from state to state. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about what we see commonly across the states. In many states, in statute, the statute provides for the governance structure and the system of delivery of education. State statutes may also address state education standards, which are lay out what teachers must teach and students should know by the time they graduate from high school. And we also know that some states also specifically set teacher salaries as well. And then there's the system of accountability, which really holds schools accountable for ensuring that students are learning adequately. And that is typically established by statute and may also be supplemented by board rule. And then, of course, one of your primary responsibilities is funding of the education system and ensuring that state funds are allocated and that you're taking into consideration the federal funds and the local funds that blend together to ensure that students are receiving the education that they need. And again, I would really highly encourage you to visit the virtual meeting that Dan Thatcher hosted last week on Education Finance 101. It was a great basic overview of what you'll need to know as a new legislator with regard to that responsibility. So now let's talk about what education looks like today. Obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And as Austin said, our education system has been significantly disrupted, perhaps the most disrupted it's ever been. And so we know that things look very different. If you have children, or if you have friends who have children, or if you have grandchildren, you know that school looks very different and the impact on students is pretty significant this year. And when we're thinking about education today, we really sort of think about it in terms of three buckets. What's going on with schools? Are they open? Are they closed? What's happening with the education offerings right now? And then we also look at learning conditions. What does it look like right now for students who are trying to learn? And then we'll talk about the impact on students. So first of all, let's look at school closures. We know that this looks very different from community to community, but for the most part, most schools are actually closed to in-person learning. Now, this may differ by grade level. For example, many elementary schools are actually open and many rural schools are open. And this has to do with the physical size of the school or the number of students in attendance. We know that in many urban centers where we have larger middle and high schools, in most cases, those are either closed to in-person learning completely, or there's some sort of hybrid model that they're using where only half or a third of the students are in the school building at any given time to ensure social distancing. And we also know that this looks different from state to state and from district to district, depending on the number of positive cases and the positivity rate, and also the approach that particular community wants to use in their education approach this year. But the one thing that we know is there is a wide variety of opinions between parents and teachers and students and policymakers about what is the best way to deliver instruction this year in this environment. Now let's take a look at learning conditions. In most cases, as I mentioned, students are learning remotely. And that means that they need devices, they need access to broadband. And unfortunately, in many cases, families were not prepared for this sort of learning, and schools were not prepared for this sort of learning. So schools have had to scramble to get all devices for all of their teachers and equip their classrooms if that was needed. And then they've also had to scramble to ensure that all students have access to devices. In some cases, we know that students are come from families where they don't necessarily have computers and they're sharing mobile devices to try to do their learning. And in many cases, there are families who either don't have access to broadband or have inadequate access to broadband just because of the number of devices that families are using right now. And this has placed a really significant burden on parents. When I know you've heard in the news a lot of stories about the challenges of parents who are trying to also possibly work from home or aren't able to be home while their students are at home learning. And so this has placed a big burden on parents to ensure that there's some adult there to help their students with technology issues. And then the impact on students has been very significant. We know that many students are reporting significant anxiety, frustration, depression. There's a lot of concern in the youth mental health community about the impact this is having on students. Academically, there's been learning loss for sure, and experts are still trying to assess the amount of learning loss. And we know that this is going to differ from child to child and may even be different from subject to subject. And so we're trying to get a handle, but we know that there has been certainly some learning loss, that students aren't able to learn in the same way that they were used to in an in-person environment. Unfortunately, this has disproportionately impacted students of color and those in poverty. And we also know that it's particularly impacted students with learning disabilities or physical disabilities, and also those English learners as well. So as a result, of course, legislatures are responding to this. We saw some activity in 2020 where states potentially paused or came back into session to address the situation. And now we're also seeing 2021 legislation as well. And here are some just really broad trends that we're seeing. We do know that states are providing, or at least considering providing, additional funding for online learning, for the protective equipment that they need to ensure that students and teachers and everyone in the building are safe, and to improve the ventilation systems. We also know that they had to go back and revisit their statutes that determine the minimum number of hours or days that students must be in class or that education is offered. And in some cases, they had to make adjustments to that to account for what happened at the end of last school year. If the schools closed, or if they continue to offer online learning. They also had to make adjustments in some cases to distinguish that the learning could be offered in a virtual or online setting. Assessments and accountability is a big area of conversation within states. During the last spring of 2020, those annual statewide assessments that we often see in the spring were not administered, and the federal government gave a waiver to states, and so states did not administer those because most students either weren't in school or were in an online setting, and states weren't prepared to administer those at that point. And they waived the accountability requirements that go along with that. So as that data is collected on how well students are doing, that has an impact on the ratings that schools get, and also in some cases the evaluations for teachers. And so all of that was waived in most states last year. And now states are starting to consider whether or not they should do the same thing for 2021, and of course waiting for a determination from the U.S. Department of Education on whether they can get a reprieve from those assessments and what kind of impact that will have on their accountability system. And of course, they're starting to look ahead to recovery and remediation. And so we're starting to see a good number of bills that address some sort of a strategy to bring students up to speed and rebuild the education system. So as we're looking forward to recovery, and many prefer to think about it as rebuilding the education system, we know that there were changes that many had hoped that we could make to make difference in our education system and to improve our education system. So some are really thinking of this as a really opportune time to reassess what we were doing and to think about how to improve going forward. And as we're doing this, again, there are three buckets that we can really think of. The first is reopening schools. Will schools be open this fall? That is a big question, and I think most are hoping and assuming that that will be the case, particularly if we can get our teachers vaccinated. So some considerations or conversations that are going on within the states and districts are, of course, updating the metrics for reopening. Every state has determined thresholds for where, based on advice from their health officials on what the community spread can or should look like if schools are going to be reopened at any point, but particularly this fall. So they'll need to update that based on their current conditions. And then, of course, as I mentioned, vaccinations is the really big piece here. Teachers in most states are beginning to be vaccinated right now. And so most assume that hopefully they will all be vaccinated by this fall. But we also know that students likely will not be vaccinated. And so this leaves us in a precarious situation about how to go forward in that situation. We also know that that states are considering, again, upgrading their ventilation system. They'll certainly need to ensure that if the school is full of students, how are you going to make sure that there's adequate space? If we're still being advised to have distancing, what does that look like and how do schools accommodate that, particularly larger schools with larger student populations? And also, how do you make sure that your HVAC system is up to speed and is ventilating the air as well as it possibly could be? The one thing that is going to be super interesting is we know that many parents have have taken advantage of school choice this year to opt their students either into private schools, charter schools that may be open full time, these learning pods that we're hearing about, or staying at home to do online schooling. The real question, I think, for school district officials and for state policymakers will be, will those students return? Will we have the same number of students in the building? And how do we accommodate that? And how do we provide flexibility for the families who aren't ready to send their kids back to school full time? One thing is for sure is that there will have to be a lot of transparency in these conversations. And it will be, I'm sure, a goal of policymakers to ensure that they're talking with the community and they're getting as much community support behind whichever decision they decide to make. The next bucket is addressing the impact on students. As I said, we know that students have been significantly impacted, and moving forward, schools and parents and the community at large and state policymakers are going to need to think about what kind of an impact, what is the situation with students coming out of this, and making sure that we have the resources to help students. What does that entail? Well, as I mentioned, we have a really significant problem particularly in some school districts where students and maybe even families have just completely withdrawn from the school system, and we're not exactly sure where they are. They may be technically enrolled in a school, but just not attending either in person, if that's the option, or online, or they may just be completely missing. We know that many school districts are reporting a large percentage of students, 20%, as many as 20% of high school students are missing right now. So it will be a big job to try to re-engage those students, not only the students, but the families, to ensure that trust is there. I'm reading news stories of families feeling like trust is broken, that the school districts and others didn't fully appreciate the challenges that their families had. And so the trust is missing there. So this is going to be a significant undertaking for schools and policymakers. We also know that they're going to have to plan for quarantines and for social distancing, which we know has an impact on students. Students don't like to be told that they need to quarantine. They don't like to be socially distanced. And so we're going to have to continue to work through that with students. We're going to have to think about the amount of learning loss that there's been and the ways, the tools that we'll need to be putting in place to evaluate that. And then probably top of mind, I know for most policymakers, is the mental health and the social emotional needs that are going to be there for the students. Will you have the counselors that are going to be available? How will you provide supports to those students who either have become disengaged or are exhibiting concerning signs that the school is going to want to take it and the community at large is going to want to address? And then what are learning conditions going to look like going forward? What does it look like in the school? How is this impacting the conditions in which students learn? We know that teachers are going to be teaching in a different environment. They certainly have had to make a switch on the fly. And so how will school districts go forward with providing them with the professional development that they need to move forward next fall? School's not going to look the same next fall. I think most experts agree on that. There probably is going to be more technology integrated now that schools have better technology devices, and now that teachers have used these technology devices. So professional development is going to be needed to ensure that teachers are ready to teach in this new environment going forward. We also know there's going to have to be some staffing adjustments. So based on what we know about the learning loss, school district and school officials will have to be thinking about, do we need more reading recovery specialists? Do we need more math teachers? Do we need extra math tutors? Do we need master teachers to come in where we didn't necessarily need them before? So I think there's going to be some good, rich discussions about how best to meet the needs of the students where they're at when they begin this fall. And again, how do you provide additional supports for those students who are disproportionately impacted? That is going to be a big question. And again, that will definitely affect the staffing needs and the plans for remediation within the school. So as a new legislator or a new legislative staffer, we wanted to be sure that you know of the resources that we have at NCSL for you. We have put together this really robust bill tracking database around everything related to COVID. As you can see on your right-hand side of the screen, that's a picture of the actual database. And as you can see, there's a number of education topics that you can search by, but there's other ways that you can search for enactments, and all policy areas are included in this particular database. So it's a really great way for you to search to try to figure out if other states are doing something that you're curious about, or to get some ideas about how your state can move forward. And in the area of K12 education, we have a great education page that we've put together that provides an overview of much of what I just discussed and goes into some more detail. And also, again, talks about state-specific approaches to each of these pieces. We've also been partnering with other organizations, the CDC, research experts, to make sure that we've got those resources posted. And we also have all of our own resources posted a lot. Of course, we've been writing about this a lot and speaking about it a lot and holding virtual meetings. So I would really encourage you to check out those resources we have. If you have a question on a topic, chances are there's some resource there that goes into some detail about this, whether it be a virtual meeting, a podcast, a blog, or something from the CDC. Hopefully it's there for you. And if it's not, of course, you can always ask questions of all of us. This is our K12 policy team who are primarily focused on answering your questions with regard to COVID. Dan is our education finance expert, and so he can answer all things related to finance. And then Benjamin and I are working together to try to get all of your questions answered generally about COVID. And then we're also working with our early learning team and our folks who focus on social emotional learning and out of school supports to bring all of our expertise together. But you can consider us to be your points of contact, and we'll get you where you need to be and make sure that all of your questions are answered. So at that point, I'm going to stop there and I'm going to throw it back to Austin for any questions.
Thank you, Michelle. I think a lot of our questions are going to be diving deeper into the presentation that you just gave us, but we do have one question from the chat that I partly have to handle, but I want to give you a bit of an angle on that question as well. So from Pierce, we have the question: has the new administration giving any clue as to whether it will grant a waiver for summative assessments this spring, should states proceed with plans for administering assessments? So Michelle, I'll handle the first part of the question and potentially the second part of the question. But one of the things I was curious about is for you to give us a sense of what conversations are happening at the state level around assessment. I know that there's a state conversation about whether to give state assessments that may not be federally required. There's also a question about whether to give the state assessments that are federally required. There's also a larger conversation around whether to give less assessments, better quality assessments. So not only are we talking about assessments in the current moment, where it's whether to give them or not in the state that education is in, but also a bigger question about what is the purpose of tests? Are we giving them in normal times in a way that is providing meaningful data on students? So that's for you to think about, Michelle. In terms of the question about the current administration, so where we're at in terms of the federal implications of the federal process for granting waivers is we're not sure. But I can kind of give you my sense of what a timeline might be for when states might know whether the federal government will grant waivers on assessments or accountability for this spring. We know that a couple weeks ago, the Secretary of Education nominee Miguel Cardona passed through a committee vote in the Senate, which means that his next step before he becomes officially the Secretary of Education is a floor vote in the Senate, a confirmation vote. We're not sure when that's going to happen. I would anticipate that happens in the next week or maybe 2 weeks. I think that there's definitely a sense that he needs to be confirmed sooner rather than later. And the reason he needs to be confirmed sooner rather than later is because the message that we've received, kind of implicitly, is that the Department of Education is not going to be making any determinations on waivers for assessment or accountability provisions until he is officially in office. Just to give you a sense of the transition, the Department of Education is just starting to staff up. They have some new officials. From our perspective, and I think from their perspective, they've mostly been working on reopening guidance. The CDC last week just came out with updated guidance on school reopening, and the Department of Education released some supplementary materials. So from our involvement with them, they've been wanting to know, what do states and districts and schools need in terms of reopening guidance? So I think that's been their focus. But I would guess that soon they will turn their focus over to assessment and accountability. So I would think that the timeline for this is we have to wait till Cardona is confirmed, which will take a couple weeks. And then it may be a week or two or more before we find out, what the final assessment or determination is. If they're doing it anything like they've done the reopening guidance, hopefully there'll be an opportunity for stakeholders like state legislators to weigh in on that ultimate decision. I can just give you a little sense of what Cardona said at this confirmation hearing. He was pretty non-committal about whether to grant waivers or not. And I think that's reflective of, there's a bit of a division, I think, even within the Democratic Party about assessments. There's one camp that has been pretty clear throughout this pandemic that there should not be assessments this spring, given the operational status of schools, and many students haven't even been to a physical classroom in a year. We know many students haven't even shown up to class. And there's also concern that students are tired and dealing with social and emotional issues that might be exacerbated by having to go through assessment. So that's one side, but then there's another side. It's more reflected in the civil rights community that says we have to know how low-income students are doing in this pandemic. We know there's learning loss, but we need assessments to figure out whether there's learning loss. And I think Cardona will have to deal with those two perspectives. And from the comments that he made during the hearing, I think he kind of stayed right down the middle of those two perspectives. So I would think that I think there is some consensus, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, some consensus that there would at least be some targeted waivers for accountability provisions. But in terms of the assessments, I think that conversation, I don't think there's been a decision made. And I think that there's still a lot of opportunity for conversation. I think that they'll probably make sure that they see what the situation is for reopening in a few weeks and kind of make a determination based on that. So it's going to be a little bit. So whether states should proceed with plans at this point, you have to. because there's a chance that they don't grant those, but waivers, or even offer a waiver process. But right now, I really don't have a great sense of whether which way they're going to go, and I'm not sure if anybody does in the conversations that I've been able to have. So that's kind of the federal perspective, but also bleeds over into the state perspective. Michelle, how is this conversation going in states? I know that there's many perspectives, many opinions, and many different states for all those conversations to take place.
That's absolutely right. And I guess I would also just mention that it's great to have Austin on here to answer those questions. Austin, of course, is our federal affairs expert and is your contact on all things related to what's going on at the federal level. So it's great to have him on here too. And so we obviously work very closely with Austin on trying to answer all your questions about what in the world's going on and the intersect between the federal requirements and the state requirements. So as you all know, or may not know, but we'll hopefully find out soon if you didn't, that all states are required by the feds to administer annual statewide assessments for purposes of accountability. And I would just reiterate, those spring assessments really are for the purposes of accountability. They are not intended to be immediate feedback for parents or students or teachers on how well students are doing. And I think there's some misconception about that. They can be used for that when you get them next fall, but that isn't necessarily helpful in the moment. So because of that federal requirement, as Austin mentioned, there's a lot of discussion in the states about what should we do. Last year, the states didn't administer the assessments. This year, there isn't clear direction from the Department of Education on whether or not they're going to be given any leeway. We are starting to see legislation pop up that would change that. And we know there's lots of discussions going on in state boards of education as well, because some of that comes in some states actually flows through the state boards of education. But it really begs the larger question, as Austin pointed to, about assessments, about their role, about how often they should be administered. I think it's important to distinguish between the formative or interim assessments that teachers give that, the formative assessments are those tests that they give to see if the students have mastered content on a chapter or a unit. The interim assessments are meant to give immediate feedback, and they're typically administered 2 or 3 times a year. And they give immediate feedback to the teachers and to the students on how well they're doing. And in theory, they're aligned to the state standards. So those tests can tell you how well the students are mastering the content they're supposed to be learning. And then of course you have the other assessments. So the big question is with this basket of assessments, what really is essential to helping us understand how well students are learning? And we know from other high-performing countries around the world and jurisdictions, they don't assess the same way that we do. So it is a broader conversation, but I can tell you around the annual statewide assessments that are required, at least at this point, to be given by the feds, there's, as Austin said, there's a real mix there's arguments on both sides, and it doesn't neatly break down along partisan lines either about whether or not we can or should give those assessments this year. But all to say that the time is running out to make those decisions because they're typically given in late March or April. So states are going to have to figure out a path forward pretty quickly.
Thanks, Michelle. I'll also add that to the partisan divide, you had Republican Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos in the fall say that states should not expect waivers. But then the new Senate chairman for the ranking member for the Republicans, Richard Burr, came out at the confirmation hearing for Cardona and said that states should get a waiver from assessment. So there is bipartisan divide on this issue. And I think that there's still a lot of conversation left to be had about this, even though there's been plenty of pontification done already. Michelle, I wanted to dig into, the conversation around assessment is partly tied into learning loss. And as you mentioned, that sometimes state assessments aren't necessarily the best means to give us a sense of exactly how students are struggling and in what particular ways in the subjects that they're tested in. But they want to use those assessments to talk about learning loss and how do we target resources to address learning loss. Can you give us a survey, and you did this a little bit in your presentation, of the range of strategies, both short-term and long-term, that legislators or stakeholders in education are discussing to actually address the learning loss that has occurred?
Thank you for the question, because I think this is going to be the big topic of conversation going forward, if not funding, but certainly how are we going to both determine how much learning loss, where the learning loss is, and then how to move forward. There are definitely instruments out there that teachers and school districts, and even some cases states across the state, use these interim assessments at the beginning of the year, at the middle of the year, and at the end of the year to see where students are at. And so there are instruments out there that can be used to determine where students are at. Whether or not they'll be administered or are being administered at the end of this year, I think that really depends on the school district and the unique approaches that are being used. So in some cases, there might already be some way to determine if students are behind or if they're stagnant, or if they haven't made the progress that they need to be making already. Certainly, we know that there's a discussion about how to use those instruments next fall, when it might be a more normal setting where those assessments might be administered at the beginning of the year to give teachers a good sense of where their new students are at. In between, there's a lot of discussion about the use of both, I don't want to say summer school per se, and in some cases it's just being summer school, but it's learning opportunities that students can have this year that might be recommended where there's already some sort of learning loss identified that will be offered for students. We know that Tennessee has a bill that was introduced, I believe it's a House bill, that neatly lays this out, where there would be different opportunities for these, like boot camps or intensive 4-week opportunities for students who can begin to catch up. And I know that I think that obviously the intent of that is to get kids caught up as much as possible. I have been hearing concerns, from the parent community or the student community that kids are already mentally, physically burned out. Just can't do it anymore. So, whether or not this will be mandated, this will be optional, but states are definitely trying to figure this out. There's also discussions around like tutoring cores to make sure that if we identify, for example, that a group of students is really behind in reading, that there'll be this core of either retired teachers or community experts or, maybe college students who can come in and supplement the instruction that's happening at the school to help. So I think there's going to be a lot of creative discussion. And the interesting thing about this is these are the kinds of things that some had been advocating for anyway, because we know there's a huge achievement gap. There's always been an achievement gap. And so what we're seeing right now is a more persistent achievement gap. And so these strategies, if they're found to be successful and useful, might be things that we can be doing with any student who happens to find themselves behind for whatever reason.
Well, thanks, Michelle. And I know we could talk all day about all the various K-12 issues, but we have a lot to cover in higher ed too. So I want to move on to that portion of our program, but we'll keep you around in case any other K-12 questions do come up. We'll have some time to address higher ed questions once Sunny gets done, and any remaining questions that you all may have. So don't hesitate to use the Q&A box. But now I'd like to move to my colleague, Sunny Day, who's the director of NCSL's higher education program and is our, of course, a preeminent higher education expert who's going to talk to us about how higher education in the States are being impacted by the pandemic. Hi, Sunny.
Oh, thank you, Austin. Hello, everyone. I will start today with a big picture overview of the impacts of COVID-19 on higher education, and then I'll move into state policy responses. First, I'd like to pose a question to our audience about today's college student. If you would, please find poll 1 on your screen and give us your best guess. So here's the question. What percentage of today's college student is over the age of 25? Is it less than 35%, or more than 35%? I ask this question to get you thinking about today's college student, which is a changing demographic story. Your dorm-bound college freshman is now but a sliver of the students who are currently attending college. So let's do one more. Please pull up poll 2. What percentage of today's college students works while attending school? Is it more than 60%? Or is it less than 60%? Thanks for your participation, everyone. It does look like a lot of you are on the right track. So I ask these questions because it really is important to regularly take a step back and reframe our picture of today's college student. Today's college student is much less likely to be your typical college freshman who just graduated from high school and is attending college full-time. In fact, among today's college students, almost 40% of students are 25 years of older. And this percentage is growing every year. This means that the students you once thought of as non-traditional are really becoming your traditional higher education student. Almost half of students are first-generation students, meaning that their parents did not attend college. 42% of students are students of color. 64% of students work while in school, and incredibly, 40% are now working full-time while also attending college. So increasingly, today's college students are facing additional challenges as they progress through their education, including things like transportation and childcare and food and housing, but above all, affordability. And of course, affordability is not just about college access, it's about college completion. How will the pandemic impact students' ability not to just get to college, but to get through college? Big concerns remain about the impact of the forced move to full-time online learning for college students. Research indicates that student performance, particularly for those who are already struggling, can seriously suffer in online courses. And unfortunately, today, about 20% of college students have issues accessing effective technology, such as a working laptop or a reliable internet connection. And while there are pitfalls for students who want or need to transfer schools, which is certainly increasing during this time of upheaval in our country. Importantly, when transferring schools, students lose, on average, more than 40% of the credits they've already earned and paid for, which of course requires them to retake courses and spend extra time and money to get to that degree. And then another issue that I really want to highlight is student supports. We know that low income, first generation students in particular, benefit from deeper engagement with guidance counselors or mentor networks that are now less accessible and potentially on the cutting block. And meanwhile, of course, graduating students enter a highly unsteady labor market with unemployment unpredictable for the foreseeable future. I also want to address challenges facing institutions. Disrupted admissions and recruitment are making it difficult to plan, with student enrollment and retention remaining a real concern. So recent data shows that overall post-secondary enrollment declined by just under 3% in the fall of 2020, and that freshman classes, though, were significantly smaller, particularly at community colleges, where first-time student enrollment dropped 21%. Additionally, new international student enrollment dropped by 43%. So, as institutions confront declining enrollment, budget uncertainties, of course, are looming. After entering 2020 with plans to boost budgets, at least a dozen states were forced instead to make dramatic cuts to higher education. And many states, of course, are finding themselves in a fragile fiscal situation in 2021. Student debt continues to be a drain on the economy. Many of you can likely relate to the stress of student loans, whether they're yours or your children's or your constituents. Last year, collective US student debt reached a record 1.6 trillion owed by roughly 45 million Americans. Of great concern is that young borrowers saddled with student debt might be delaying home ownership, marriage, parenthood, and turning down other opportunities. And we're hearing increasing concern for student debt held by parents and by grandparents. So in the past 30 or so years, the average amount borrowed by parents tripled to more than $16,000 per year, and parents are borrowing for more than 1 year and more than one child. So I'll turn now to state policy actions legislatures are taking, starting with state actions to mitigate the negative effects of student loan debt. So first, the issue of student loan oversight. Since 2015, at least 13 states have passed legislation to expand student loan oversight. This includes new regulations and consumer protections regarding lending, borrowing, and repayment. And these bills often created a student loan ombudsman to serve as the state's connection for student loan borrowers, to help oversee servicers, and to assist borrowers when they have problems. Another big issue we're seeing legislative action around is the issue of student loan forgiveness or repayment. So legislators in at least 18 states have enacted bills relating to student loan forgiveness or repayment assistance. This includes loan relief for borrowers who work in certain professions or who meet certain criteria, for example, remaining in their state after graduation. We've also seen bills offering tax credits or deductions to businesses that help employees pay their student loans. And finally, a number of states have addressed student loan licensure and borrower consequences. So these bills address the concern that punitive consequences for student loan default, especially those that revoke professional or occupational licenses, really take away the earning power borrowers need to get back on track to repay their loans. Funding and affordability looms large. State legislators are taking a fresh look at funding. We are seeing a trend toward policies that encourage students to apply for all and receive all available aid, financial aid. So for example, Washington state legislation passed last year creates several new initiatives to promote financial aid application completion, including research-based policies, such as a standardized template for financial aid award packages. It's often very hard for a student to compare one financial aid letter to another from two institutions because they don't use the same language. This is trying to tackle that issue. To my knowledge, this is the first state to implement this statewide. Another tool that they put in place in Washington state through legislation is a financial aid advising day for high school students. And then a centralized online tool for students to calculate the cost of attendance. FAFSA completion is an emerging state policy issue that is being exacerbated by the pandemic. This is the free application for federal student aid used to determine eligibility for federal student aid, including loans, grants, and work study. Several states, to date, Louisiana, Texas, and Illinois, now mandate FAFSA completion for high school seniors. We do anticipate that this could continue to be an issue of concern, given that FAFSA applications are decreasing significantly from this time a year ago. To date, the statistics are around the high school class of 2021 has 16% fewer FAFSA completions than this time last year. Another issue I want to raise is outcomes-based funding. This issue continues to evolve. So outcomes-based funding uses public money to encourage colleges and universities to increase the numbers and percentages of students who earn high-quality degrees, certificates, and other credentials. It essentially funds colleges and universities based on how well they perform on key metrics. Interestingly, Colorado's latest iteration of outcomes-based funding was passed last year and includes new metrics aimed at significantly increasing the success of traditionally underserved students. The new model includes factors such as underrepresented minority student population share, the Pell eligible student population share, and first generation student population share, in addition to the traditional retention and completion rates mentioned previously. And finally, we know that reskilling and upskilling will remain crucial in this uncertain economic environment. Policymakers are increasingly focused on providing reliable, timely information about career pathways and opportunities, including workforce and earnings outcomes. For example, Kentucky's new legislation requires compilation of the most in-demand jobs in the state, along with salary information. It also requires institutions of higher education to publish the cost of attendance, graduation rates, and starting salaries for graduates. So as I mentioned earlier, many states continue to find themselves in a fragile fiscal situation for 2021. Even prior to the pandemic, we had been seeing signs of trouble with institutional stability and financial stability in some states. Now, new legislative oversight or shifts in authority could be in order to protect students and local economies when campuses do close or change programs. So, for example, Pennsylvania legislation enacted last year provides the State Higher Education Board with expanded authority to implement mergers and consolidations for campuses of up to 10,000 students without the explicit approval of the legislature in order to better manage and optimize programs and coordination among campuses. On the private college side, after the abrupt closure of a small private college in 2018, Massachusetts lawmakers passed a bill requiring assessment of each institution's financial strength each year. If an institution is determined to be at risk of closure, that school must develop contingency plans to protect students and faculty in case it does close. I'd like to move now to the legislative responses we saw to COVID-19 during the last year. As the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted higher education in the spring, some specific legislative responses included flexibility and affordability during the pandemic. So, for example, this includes necessary modifications to deadlines or to requirements for state financial aid programs to ensure proper eligibility during the pandemic, such as waiving tests or other eligibility provisions for financial aid. Maryland addressed emergency preparedness, requiring public institutions of higher education to submit outbreak response plans to include notification of students, families, faculty, and staff of an outbreak, and to report disease outbreaks to local and state health providers. I'll move briefly now to our analysis of the more than 1,200 post-secondary education bills that have been introduced since the beginning of this year. First, bills addressing enrollment and admissions. Given the dips in enrollment and acknowledging the challenges facing incoming students during the pandemic, many states are reviewing legislation to modify admission practices. So, Colorado Illinois and New York will consider bills to move to test optional admissions by removing requirements for ACT or SAT testing as part of admissions criteria. Connecticut and Georgia will consider bills to prioritize admission for in-state students. Under the umbrella of affordability and financial aid, with budgets remaining in the spotlight, states will continue to explore strategies to increase affordability and boost financial aid access for students. At least 5 states are considering the creation of new promise programs to provide scholarships to cover costs for students to attend community college. And another 6 states are considering whether to make FAFSA completion mandatory for high school seniors. So I want to close by sharing a few resources. Our bill tracking databases that can help you drill down really to get a sense of what is being considered in state legislatures. First, NCSL's higher education team will continue to track all post-secondary legislation in 2021 in the NCSL post-secondary bill tracking database here. This database includes pending and enacted legislation in 40 higher education categories ranging from admissions and affordability to workforce development. The database includes more than 1,200 bills that have already been introduced this year. I also want to share a really neat tool, our student loan debt legislative tracking database. This allows you to view state legislation that addresses student loan oversight, consumer protection, loan forgiveness or payment assistance, and the tax incentive legislation that I talked about. And finally, I encourage you to reach out to any member of our higher education team. Here's our contact information. We'd love to hear from you about what higher education is doing in your state and certainly what questions you have. We're happy to help. So with that, thanks for having me, and please follow up by email or in the chat if I can provide additional information.
Well, thanks so much, Sunny, and thanks for posting all of those resources. I know that I'm due to revisit the student loan legislation page because that's a big topic in Washington, D.C., and it's important that our federal friends understand how states are dealing with student loans. I'd like to encourage our audience to ask any questions for Sunny on higher education, and if you have any leftover questions for Michelle on K12, we might also bring her back on, but I want to stay focused on higher ed right now. Sunny, I have a question for you, and this is in the similar vein of what DC is focused on. Big thing around here is free college. It's kind of been the perennial conversation, but we know as federal government, Congress thinks about what they might want to do around free college. We know that states have also been taking action, and in fact have put forward a lot of programs that I think the federal government has looked at as potential examples for their own consideration. So can you give us a sense of the trajectory of college promise programs? When do they start? How many of them are there, and how are they being impacted by the pandemic?
Yeah, so right now about a third of the states have some version of what we're calling a promise program. I'll define that on the books. It means that they're committing to covering the cost of a student's tuition and sometimes those additional costs that I mentioned, non-tuition costs at a post-secondary institution in the state. So what's important to understand is that these programs are meant to be last dollar programs. They bridge the gap between financial aid and need. They typically cover multiple institutions across the state. They generally have eligibility requirements linked to state residency or to income or to high school graduation. There are 3 buckets we're seeing for promise programs. Those focused on community colleges are really the majority, but we're also seeing states aim these dollars at adults and in some cases at specific credential programs. The story seems to be that these are popular and growing as more states are considering them this year, even in this uncertain fiscal environment. And so we'll see. I think as states are thinking about where to direct their dollars, they're finding that this is popular and that this idea of free college is growing. And especially when they can aim those programs at the student populations that they're trying to help improve graduation outcomes. So promise programs seem to be a growing trend in the states. I think the ones, like I said, about a third of them are on the books. Whether or not they will have full funding is an unanswered question.
Thanks. I want to stay on this topic of trends, and this is a kind of a broad question about just higher ed trends in general. And the framing for this that I want to kind of present is, typically during a recession, we see a couple things, and this has been a trend over the last few recessions that we've had, is that typically student enrollment in higher ed goes up, and that's because the opportunity, in the long terms, the opportunity cost of attending college has gone down. There's not as good of employment. It's a great opportunity to invest in your education for new job outcomes. So we see an increase in student enrollment, and typically because states have less tax revenue during a recession, we see a lowering of state revenue devoted towards higher education in recessions, and that tends to recover over time afterwards. So we see those two trends. One, from your perspective, will those trends hold up? And two, are there any new trends that we're seeing? So something that I'm just kind of throwing out here is, normally it's not a big deal for a student to cross state lines for education, but maybe because of the pandemic and students being restricted from traveling or even thinking outside of their own state context, are we seeing any decreases in out-of-state enrollment at other institutions? A recent trend we saw were for school closures in the last few years. Do we think that that might continue or maybe even be exacerbated given this financial situation? So trends generally, talk about how does this pandemic compare to a typical recession? And then just mention any other trends that you've kind of picked up that you think would be interesting for our audience.
Sure. Austin, the two things that you specifically talk about, enrollment trends and sort of tuition increases, are really up in the air this time around. So the patterns that have held in the past through recessions are not necessarily holding this time around. So for one, enrollment has not increased and is still very iffy. Community colleges took the hardest hit, but across the board institutions are seeing less first-year students and issues with retainment. So that's still an open question and probably has a lot to do with how safe they feel returning to campus and whether the investment in higher education on-campus learning is the right one when it might end up being remote, right? I think that's a decision a lot of students and families are making right now. And those non-traditional older students as well. With regard to whether or not tuition is going to balance the budget this year, so what happens and what has happened over the past few decades is as state budgets are squeezed by things that they have to pay for, those costs that they can't change, the sort of discretionary budget has gotten smaller and smaller, and higher ed has been on the cutting block almost every time. It's easier to cut the state funding to institutions and then allow them to raise tuition. But the last couple of years, there's a huge outcry about where tuition has gone. It's just increased so far beyond, regular increased living costs. I think that, I know from the legislators around the country that we talk to, that there's just a sense that there's no longer room to keep pushing tuition up. So they're going to have to look for more thoughtful, strategic solutions to balancing their higher education budgets, getting institutions what they need, but hopefully directing those resources in such a way that they are meeting their ultimate attainment and sort of state education and workforce goals. And so if your goal is to get more students, short-term certificates, you might structure programs around that a little bit more. I think overall what I'm trying to say is I think states are thinking a lot more about specific budget items in higher ed budgets and less just sort of across the board cuts.
Well, thank you for that. We have a question from our audience and it has a federal component, so I'll address that after we hear from you. And the question is, do the states that mandate FAFSA completion offer assistance to families when it comes to filling out the application?
I think that's something of an unanswered question because I get that question too. I do know, I can say to you that they all have pretty clear and robust opt-out provisions for whatever reason. In terms of whether or not they're helping, I think that's why you're seeing initiatives like the Washington one, where they're creating a full day of financial aid advising. This is not necessarily built into the curriculum, the helping students with FAFSA completion. And as you might imagine, there could be some personal information, kind of permeating that may not be comfortable to. So this is a sort of up in the ongoing question. And we'll continue to dig in that and kind of try to share with you how this is playing out. I will say that Louisiana has had this policy in place the longest, and they have seen the biggest increase in their FAFSA completion in the country.
Well, thanks. And there's also a federal side of this to the question. In the last couple of months, or actually in the last stimulus package, there was actually some significant changes to how the FAFSA is constituted and how federal aid is dispersed. So the big headline from the stimulus package, and I'll drop, we have a blog on these changes that I'll drop into the chat real quick. Essentially, the FAFSA has been significantly simplified. It used to have a maximum of 108 questions, which is a lot to go through, and a lot of them were duplicative, and you'd have to fill in sensitive financial information multiple times, which took a really long time. They've decreased that from 108 maximum down to 36 question maximum. What they've also done is, and this was not something that they could do before, but they have now an information sharing agreement with the IRS so that parents can request that their information, the tax information that's housed at the IRS, be shared with the Department of Education when they fill out their FAFSA form, which one makes it much easier for students to, you don't have to get all these forms out to fill in all the boxes. And so it makes it much easier for this kind of confusing form to be completed. So that's one of the big changes, is going to be, should be a lot more streamlined and easy for anyone to access and complete. And there's also been some changes. One, some other things that are really important that states could take advantage of is the Pell Grant has been made more generous. The eligibility for which incomes apply for the or can apply for the Pell Grant or receive it have been extended. There's now a new minimum Pell award. Before there was a maximum Pell, but now students can kind of know in advance, maybe 2 years before they fill out their FAFSA, that they probably will qualify for at least a minimum award. And so then when they actually go and fill out the form, maybe their senior year, they'll know that they at least have that minimum, but it's possible that they qualify up to the maximum Pell too. So it's a really nice communication tool for states and schools to use to let students know that there's financial aid available for them. And I'll put that in the chat real quick. See if we have any more questions. I don't believe we do. So I'd like to just take this time to close us out for today. So Sunny and Michelle, thank you so much for all the great information you provided. And I'd like to thank our audience for joining us here today. We have a bunch of resources that we've shared with you that we hope will help you make sense of everything that's happening in K-12 and higher education. And you can reach out to us anytime if you have K-12 questions, Michelle and her team, higher ed questions, Sunny and her team. If you have any questions about federal policy, K-12 or higher education, please send them to me or send that to any one of us, and we'll find the right people to get your response. So we hope you've enjoyed your time today. If you plan to attend more sessions this afternoon, we hope that those go well for you. And of course, remind you that our last week of our 101 series is next week, and our education team is once again presenting a session on early learning. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here today, and we hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks.